Some substances on the DOT testing panel are strictly illegal, leaving very little room for explanation. Amphetamines present a far more complicated picture. Today, they are tightly regulated medications with millions of legitimate prescriptions. But reaching this point required navigating a completely unregulated and chaotic history. The compound was first synthesized in a laboratory in 1887, but its effects on the human body went mostly ignored for decades. That changed in the late 1920s when American chemist Warden Alice resynthesized it, tested it on himself, and documented its potent stimulant properties. By 1933, the drug reached the market as Benzedrine, an over-the-counter nasal inhaler marketed for asthma and congestion. The public quickly realized they could break the casing open and ingest the amphetamine strip directly for a massive stimulant effect. During World War II, governments deliberately harnessed that effect. Both Allied and Axis forces issued amphetamines to their troops as official military policy, using them to combat fatigue and sustain alertness among bomber crews and pilots. By the war's end, American and British forces alone distributed an estimated 150 million amphetamine tablets. This government-sponsored wartime usage normalized the practice of using stimulants to chemically cheat human exhaustion. The habit became culturally ingrained long before medical science caught up to the severe long-term risks. Following the war, the existing amphetamine supply chains pivoted entirely into civilian life. Pharmaceutical companies aggressively marketed the stimulant for weight loss, often prescribing it in colorful combinations of sedatives and diuretics, known as rainbow pills. One prominent weight loss drug, Obetrol, combined amphetamine and methamphetamine salts and achieved immense cultural saturation. The artist Andy Warhol was a documented daily user, reportedly on his way to refill his prescription the morning he was shot in 1968. By 1970, roughly 5% of all American adults were using prescription amphetamines. Following Senate investigations that documented dozens of deaths and rampant misuse across the country, the government intervened, placing the substance into Schedule II and sharply restricting its production. While weight loss clinics drove the civilian boom, a parallel black market for amphetamine PEP pills was growing among long-haul truck drivers. Driven by intense schedules and competitive pressure in the 1950s and 60s, drivers used the stimulants to survive through the night. Illicit stimulant use to fight fatigue is a deeply rooted behavioral pattern in commercial transportation. It predates federal DOT testing by more than 2 decades, and it is a primary reason this substance landed on the federal testing panel at its creation. The 1970 regulatory crackdown forced major pharmaceutical changes. Obetrol lost its FDA approval in 1973, but decades later it was reformulated without the methamphetamine and rebranded for the treatment of ADHD. Today, that formulation is sold as Adderall. Tens of millions of people worldwide now hold valid, carefully monitored prescriptions for ADHD or narcolepsy. Yet, alongside this legitimate medical use, the dangerous subculture of commercial drivers illegally acquiring stimulants to stay awake continues to persist. This creates the most critical distinction in the DOT testing program. Unlike a positive test for cocaine, which is always a violation, a positive test for amphetamines has a legally protected medical pathway. To use amphetamines legally while driving a commercial vehicle, specific conditions must be met.
The driver must have a valid prescription from a licensed professional. They must take it exactly as directed, and the medication must not impair their ability to operate safely. While amphetamine use can be legal in this industry, survival depends entirely on how well you manage your paperwork. A protected medical pathway only works for drivers who prioritize proactive disclosure and meticulous documentation. If a lab reports a positive amphetamine screen, the medical review officer contacts the driver directly. The MRO will demand proof of a valid prescription and require the prescribing physician's contact information so the treatment can be independently verified. Even when a prescription is perfectly legal, the MRO has authority over safety. They can report the result as negative with a safety concern if they determine the medication dosage or the underlying condition it treats poses a risk to someone performing safety-sensitive duties. When this safety flag is raised, the driver has a narrow window, typically 5 days, to work with their prescribing doctor to resolve the concern. If the physician cannot verify the driver is safe to work, it becomes a formal issue on their record. Some drivers worry about the age of their prescription. The idea that a DOT prescription automatically expires after 1 year is a myth. An older prescription remains valid as long as you are under that doctor's active care. However, taking leftover medication after a treatment plan has officially ended is categorized entirely as misuse. To prevent these roadblocks, tell your doctor you hold a DOT safety-sensitive position before accepting any amphetamine prescription. Your physician needs to understand the physical demands of your job to make a legal and appropriate prescribing decision. Navigating an amphetamine screen successfully means having your medical paperwork in order long before you are ever handed a sample cup. You must establish a bulletproof boundary of medical legitimacy ahead of time. Behind the regulatory rules is a precise biological mechanism. Amphetamines increase the activity of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. This triggers a sudden, artificial spike in wakefulness and a sharpened sense of focus. At moderate doses, the resulting experience closely resembles simply being well rested. Researchers call this mimicking sobriety. The driver feels completely capable, and to those around them, they appear entirely alert and clear-headed. This creates a catastrophic risk on the highway. When a driver uses stimulants specifically to push past their physical limits, the drug does not cure their exhaustion. It merely masks it. The underlying fatigue continues to accumulate beneath that chemical facade. Once the stimulant wears off, the inevitable biological crash hits hard, turning an exhausted driver into a severe public hazard. In a urine test, the detection window for amphetamines is relatively short. For occasional use, the substance typically remains detectable for only 1 to 3 days. If a test flags for amphetamines and goes to the MRO, the margins for error disappear. If a driver cannot produce a valid prescription, borrowed a pill from a family member, or misused an expired treatment plan, the review fails. The result automatically converts to a verified positive. The DOT consequences for a verified positive are immediate: mandatory removal from safety-sensitive duty, placement in prohibited status, and forced entry into the return-to-duty process. Amphetamines occupy a precarious space between a necessary medical treatment and a career-ending hazard. Staying on the right side of that line requires absolute medical transparency, leaving no room for guesswork.